My husband shoved me at our wedding. Not hard enough to knock me down. Not hard enough to leave a mark anyone could photograph and circle in red later. Just hard enough to remind me who he believed was in control. The string quartet kept playing, though the violinist's bow hesitated mid-stroke. Champagne glasses froze halfway to painted lips. A few guests laughed, short. Confused bursts of sound from people who didn't want to choose sides in a room full of money. Grant Whitmore smiled like a man who had just proven a point. He thought I would freeze. He thought humiliation would make me obedient. He thought that if he asserted his dominance before the vows were even finished, I would smooth my dress, swallow my pride, and let the ceremony continue so no one would feel uncomfortable. What he didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, I had already seen exactly who he was. And when I smiled back at him, steady, composed, almost serene, it wasn't shock. It was recognition. Because the moment he shoved me was the moment everything I had quietly prepared clicked into place. He believed he had just established control. He had no idea he had just activated something else entirely. The lake behind the estate shimmered in late afternoon light, as if nothing unusual had happened. 200 guests sat beneath a canopy of white roses and crystal chandeliers, watching what they assumed was a minor, playful misstep between bride and groom. I felt the pressure of his hand still lingering at my shoulder blade. The silk of my gown whispered against the marble floor as I steadied myself. My heel had slipped less than an inch. Enough to humiliate, not enough to rescue. I straightened slowly. Grant's grip tightened at my waist, fingers pressing through fabric as if to say, "Behave." From the third row, I caught sight of Claire Donovan rising halfway from her seat before settling again, waiting for my cue. Her expression did not change. It never did when things mattered. Grant leaned closer, smiling for the guests while his jaw remained locked. "Careful," he whispered. "Careful." The word echoed differently now. I looked out at the audience. City council members, developers, my investors, his board members, his mother, Eleanor Whitmore, seated perfectly upright, pearls resting at her throat like punctuation marks of authority. His sister Vivian, phone resting discreetly in her lap, eyes sharp and assessing. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger in ivory and champagne. I am Natalie Brooks, 34, founder of Brooks Interior Architecture, built from a 2-person studio into a regional firm with contracts across 3 states. I had never needed rescuing. I had never needed leading. Yet somewhere between the engagement party and the rehearsal dinner, Grant had begun speaking as if I did. "You'll finally have someone to handle the serious negotiations," he had joked one evening, his hand warm at my lower back as we stood among his colleagues. People laughed. I did too. At the time, there had been other moments. Small ones. Easy to excuse if you were in love. He insisted I remove Daniel, my longtime advisory partner, from an upcoming strategy meeting because, as he put it, optics matter once you're married. He suggested relocating my headquarters into Whitmore Development's building to streamline operations. He installed a security monitoring app on my phone. Claiming high-profile couples were targets, every request had been wrapped in concern, in protection, in partnership. Every request had narrowed something. The day before the ceremony, during rehearsal, I corrected the officiant about a line in the vows. Grant's fingers tightened around my elbow just a fraction too hard. "Don't improvise tomorrow," he murmured with a smile that never reached his eyes. Standing at the altar now, I realized the shove wasn't sudden. It was consistent. The officiant cleared his throat gently, uncertain whether to proceed. Grant gave him an easy nod. "Performing calm, I promise," Grant continued, voice amplified over the discreet speakers. "To lead our household with strength and protect what belongs to us." That line hadn't been in the draft. A ripple passed through the guests, barely perceptible, but real. Lead. Protect what belongs to us. His hand tightened again. Something inside me went very still. I turned slightly toward the photographer, adjusting my bouquet. A normal movement. A bride repositioning for the shot. Grant's smile thinned. Then came the shove. It lasted less than a second. A firm push at my back, disguised as guidance. My body tipped forward just enough to make the moment visible. The laughter followed. He thought the audience was his. I straightened. I adjusted my shoulders. And I smiled. Not the embarrassed smile of a woman trying to recover. The calm smile of someone who had been waiting. His eyes flickered. Just briefly, searching my face for tears or apology. He found neither. Instead, I met his gaze and let the silence stretch. He believed he had just reminded me who was in charge. What he didn't realize was that 3 weeks earlier, I had already rewritten the terms of this entire performance. And now, in front of everyone who mattered to him, he had given me the perfect reason to use them. 3 weeks before the wedding. I wasn't looking for betrayal. I was standing barefoot in Grant's penthouse kitchen, scrolling through catering confirmations while he showered upstairs. The skyline outside the windows glowed in early evening blue. And for a moment, everything felt stable, predictable, like the kind of life people envy from a distance. His laptop sat open on the marble island. I wasn't snooping. I was comparing guest RSVPs to the spreadsheet he had emailed me earlier that afternoon. At least, that's what I told myself. Then a notification slid across the top of the screen. Whitmore Holdings Legal. Subject line: Equity Transfer Schedule, Post-Marital Execution. My hand froze above the trackpad. Equity transfer. Post-marital execution. Something cold slipped through me. Sharp and precise. I waited for it to disappear. It didn't. I told myself it was probably about his company. Routine restructuring. Administrative cleanup before marriage. But the preview line beneath the subject cut through that comfort. Once she's legally bound, the leverage shifts. My name wasn't in that preview. It didn't need to be. I clicked. The email thread opened between Grant and his sister Vivian. The tone was clinical, efficient. There was no romance in it. No softness. Vivian had outlined a 90-day integration plan following our wedding. Phase 1. Symbolic autonomy. Phase 2. Operational alignment. Phase 3. Majority consolidation under Whitmore Development umbrella. They were discussing my company. Not as a partner firm. As an asset. There was a line that made my pulse slow instead of race. She won't have negotiating power after the ceremony. The legal structure will favor spousal integration. He had responded with a single sentence. That's the point. The shower upstairs shut off. Water pipes hummed faintly in the walls. I kept reading. An attached memo detailed projected revenue redirection from Brooks Interior Architecture into a joint holding structure. Intellectual property clauses. Voting rights adjustments. Advisory reassignments. All framed as family alignment strategy. Family alignment. I had built my firm from a 2-person design studio into a multi-state operation. I had survived recessions, hostile bids, and client lawsuits. And in a single email chain, I saw myself reduced to a division. There were references to conversations I remembered differently. She'll agree once she sees the long-term benefit. She values security. Security. I thought about the way he had insisted on reviewing my contracts lately. The way he had suggested moving my headquarters into his building for synergy. The security app he had insisted I install on my phone. The small corrections. The subtle rewordings. It wasn't romance. It was positioning. The bathroom door upstairs opened. I closed the email, but I didn't close the laptop. I wanted it to look untouched. My heart wasn't pounding. It was steady. Clear. Grant walked down the stairs wrapped in a towel. Hair damp. Smiling. Everything good? He asked. Perfect, I said. And in that moment, something shifted permanently inside me. The next morning, I met Claire Donovan in her office before 9. She listened without interrupting as I forwarded her the screenshots I had taken. Every word. Every timestamp. Claire was 59 and razor sharp. She had negotiated mergers that dismantled empires. She had also survived a marriage that almost dismantled her. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. This isn't about love, she said quietly. This is about leverage. I didn't argue. She explained how spousal integration laws could complicate ownership structures, how timing mattered, how signatures carried more weight than promises. If you marry him without protective counterbalance, she said, you risk losing majority control within a year. The air in her office felt thin. So what do I do? I asked. Claire didn't hesitate. You let him think he's ahead. We drafted a revised vendor consolidation addendum under the guise of streamlining vendor payments post-wedding. It appeared harmless, administrative, necessary for merging supplier networks. Buried within it were protective triggers. If either party engaged in documented coercive behavior, reputational harm, or undisclosed operational interference before integration, consolidation would automatically suspend pending review. It didn't accuse, it protected. I emailed it to Grant that afternoon. He signed within 48 hours. No questions. No revisions. He trusted his assumption more than he read the fine print. Over the next 3 weeks, I began documenting everything. Emails. Conversations. The subtle tightening of his grip when I contradicted him in public. The shift in his language from we to mine. I wasn't reacting out of panic. I was preparing. By the time we stood at the altar and he inserted the word lead into his vows, I recognized the cadence from that email thread. When he shoved me, it wasn't sudden. It was confirmation. 3 weeks earlier, I had stopped being a bride. I had become a witness. And witnesses don't freeze. They remember. 10 days before the wedding, the condo stopped feeling like mine. It was subtle at first. A new security panel near the front door. A different Wi-Fi network name blinking across my phone screen. Whitmore Secure. Grant mentioned it casually, kissing my temple as he walked past. Just upgrading things, he said. You can never be too careful. Careful. That word again. I stood in the living room that evening and noticed how the furniture seemed slightly shifted. My bookshelf angled differently. A faint reflection in the glass of a framed print that hadn't been there before. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I watched. 2 nights later, he brought up Daniel. Daniel had been my advisory partner since the early days. When Brooks Interior Architecture operated out of a cramped studio with exposed pipes and unreliable heat. He knew my contracts better than anyone. Grant leaned against the kitchen counter, swirling bourbon in a crystal glass. I've been thinking, he said. Once we're married, it might send the wrong message having another man that involved in your strategic decisions. I didn't look up from my tablet. He's my advisory partner. You won't need that kind of influence anymore, Grant replied smoothly. You'll have me? There it was. Ownership dressed as protection. Optics matter, he added, especially in family business situations. Family business. I made a small nod, as if considering it. Internally, I cataloged the phrasing. Another step toward isolation. The following Sunday, we had dinner at the Whitmore estate. Eleanor Whitmore greeted me with a kiss that landed slightly off-center on my cheek. Her pearls were flawless. So was her posture. Marriage requires surrender. Dear, she said over the appetizer course. 2 companies can't thrive with 2 captains. Vivian didn't look up from her phone. Post-marital integration always runs smoother when leadership is clearly defined, she added. Clearly defined. The email thread flashed in my mind. They weren't planning a marriage. They were planning absorption. I smiled politely through dessert. Later that week, I saw the first camera. It was small, discreet, mounted high above the bookshelf in the living room, angled just enough to capture the entire space. A tiny green LED glowed. I stared at it for a full minute before calling building management. They confirmed no external installation request had been filed. When Grant came home, I gestured toward it lightly. New decor. He laughed. High-value properties require security. You of all people should appreciate that. I stepped closer to examine it. Memorizing the serial number? And the bedroom smoke detector? I asked. Upgraded that too. Of course he had. That night, after he fell asleep, I downloaded a signal scanning app. The same one he had insisted I keep for safety. Multiple devices pinged across the network. Living room. Study. Bedroom. Not safety. Surveillance. My chest didn't tighten. It clarified. The next morning, I photographed every device, logged timestamps, forwarded everything to the encrypted folder Claire had created. When I met her 2 days later, she didn't look surprised. Control escalates when ownership feels uncertain, she said. I placed the photos in front of her. He thinks he's securing an asset, I replied. Claire's jaw tightened slightly. We strengthened the clause. We amended the addendum again, reinforcing language around documented invasive monitoring and coercive interference impacting operational autonomy. Are you prepared to enforce this publicly? She asked. If necessary, I answered. And I meant it. Meanwhile, Grant's behavior sharpened. At a fundraising dinner, he interrupted me mid-sentence while I was discussing a new commercial contract. Natalie tends to think creatively, he said with a smile. I handle the structural realities. Laughter circled the table. I smiled too. Another rehearsal. Another public correction. He introduced me twice that week as future Whitmore Design Division. Each time, something in my spine straightened rather than softened. He was testing how small he could make me without resistance. I was testing how much evidence I could gather without alerting him. The night before the rehearsal, I adjusted a line in the ceremony script, asking the officiant to remove a phrase about obedience that had somehow slipped into the draft. Grant's fingers closed around my elbow, not violently, deliberately. Don't improvise tomorrow, he whispered. Smile intact for the room. I met his eyes. I won't, I said. And I wouldn't, because by then, I understood something clearly. Humiliation in private is rehearsal for humiliation in public. If Grant needed to assert control, he wouldn't choose a quiet room. He would choose a stage. And there was no stage larger than a wedding filled with investors, board members, and family allies. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint hum of hidden cameras in my own home, I didn't wonder whether he would try to establish dominance in front of everyone. I wondered how far he would go, and whether he realized that every step he took toward control was tightening something around his own future instead. The lake shimmered behind the white floral arch as if nothing in the world could fracture what was about to happen. Lakeview Harbor Estate had been polished to perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung beneath a sheer canopy. White roses lined the aisle in symmetrical rows. 200 guests sat facing us, developers, investors, city officials, extended family, each of them dressed for celebration and quiet calculation. This was not just a wedding. It was a public alignment of power. Grant stood beside me in a tailored charcoal suit. Confident, composed, admired. He squeezed my hand for the photographer, his smile wide and practiced. Almost there, he murmured. I couldn't tell if it was reassurance or warning. From the third row, I saw Claire Donovan seated with perfect posture, her expression neutral. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the front row, pearls resting against her collarbone like a symbol of inherited authority. Vivian had her phone angled slightly in her lap, no doubt already tracking which guests were present. The music softened. The officiant began. Grant performed beautifully at first, his voice steady, his posture protective, his charm effortless. He knew how to command a room without appearing to try. When it was his turn to speak his vows, he started with the rehearsed lines. Then he shifted. I promise, he said, voice projecting clearly over the water, to lead our household with strength and protect what belongs to us. That sentence had not been in the script. A subtle ripple moved through the audience. Barely visible, but there. Lead. Protect what belongs to us. His hand tightened at my waist. I turned slightly to face the photographer, adjusting my bouquet. A natural movement. A bride repositioning for the camera. His grip stiffened. He leaned in just enough that his smile still looked romantic from the front. Don't embarrass me, he whispered. Before I could respond, His hand pressed sharply against my back. The shove lasted less than a second. My heel slipped against polished marble. The bouquet tilted. My body pitched forward just enough for the movement to register. A violin faltered mid-note. Then came the laughter. Short. Uncertain. Obedient. Grant laughed too, as if it were playful. As if he had merely steadied me. His arm tightened around me again, reclaiming the image. To anyone unwilling to look closely, it was nothing. To me, it was everything. Heat flared in my chest, not from pain, but from recognition. This was the stage he had chosen. Public, controlled, strategic. He believed I would shrink. He believed I would prioritize appearance over dignity. I straightened slowly. I adjusted my shoulders. I met his eyes. And I smiled. Not the nervous smile of a woman recovering from embarrassment. A measured smile. Deliberate. His expression flickered for a fraction of a second. He had expected shock. Maybe tears. Maybe apology. He found none. The officiant hesitated, glancing between us. Grant squeezed my hand again, this time harder. Careful, he whispered. I gently withdrew my hand from his grip. Before the officiant could resume, I spoke. Before we continue, I said calmly, projecting just enough for the front rows to hear, I'd like to clarify one administrative detail. A murmur moved across the chairs. Grant's jaw tightened, though his smile remained frozen in place. This isn't necessary, he muttered under his breath. I ignored him. The officiant blinked uncertainly. Of course, he said, stepping slightly back. From the third row, Claire rose. She did not hurry. She did not rush. She walked toward the aisle with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to entering rooms at moments of consequence. Eleanor's spine stiffened. Vivian lowered her phone slowly. Grant's grip at my waist loosened. What is this? He asked softly, smile thinning. I kept my eyes forward. It will only take a moment, I replied. Claire reached the front, standing just off to the side of the arch. The late afternoon light reflected off the water behind her, casting everything in a pale gold glow that felt almost ironic. Guests shifted in their seats. Board members leaned forward. Grant tried to reclaim the narrative with a small laugh. Just a minor legal formality, he said to the crowd. Natalie likes her paperwork. A few polite chuckles followed. He still thought this was contained. He still believed he could steer it. I felt the weight of the moment settle into place. The shove had been meant to establish control. Instead, it had drawn a line. Claire looked at me once. I nodded. The lake remained calm. The air felt thinner. Grant's smile faltered. Just slightly, as he realized this was no longer about optics. And for the first time since I stepped onto that aisle, he was no longer certain of the outcome. The silence stretched longer than any vow ever could. Claire stopped a few feet from the arch, hands clasped loosely in front of her, her presence steady and unshaken. The lake behind us shimmered in soft gold light, mocking the tension thickening the air. Grant gave a short laugh. Natalie, he murmured, still smiling for the guests. This really isn't the time. I didn't look at him. It's exactly the time, I said calmly. A ripple moved through the chairs. 200 people leaning forward without realizing it. Claire's voice carried clearly, trained by decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. Before this ceremony proceeds, she began, both parties should acknowledge the vendor consolidation addendum signed 2 weeks ago in preparation for post-marital integration of business interests. Grant's smile thinned. That's internal paperwork, he said quickly. It doesn't concern the ceremony. Claire did not raise her voice. It concerns any public conduct that impacts reputational or operational standing prior to integration. A few guests exchanged glances. I saw one of Grant's board members straighten in his seat. Grant shifted beside me. This is unnecessary, he said, now speaking more to me than to the crowd. You're overcomplicating things. I turned to face him fully for the first time since the shove. No, I said softly. I'm clarifying them. Claire continued. The agreement includes a protective clause. If either party engages in documented coercive behavior, reputational harm, or undisclosed monitoring practices prior to consolidation, integration rights are automatically suspended pending review. The words landed carefully, one by one. Suspended. Review. Grant's fingers flexed at his sides. That's absurd, he said, a sharp edge breaking through his charm. There's no coercion here. I tilted my head slightly. You shoved me, I said. A murmur passed through the crowd. This one less polite. Grant's smile returned too quickly. It was playful. She stumbled. Claire didn't blink. The clause does not require visible injury, she said evenly. It requires documented conduct. Documented. Grant's eyes flickered. Just briefly. I nodded once toward the event coordinator near the reception platform. She hesitated, then pressed a button. The large screen behind the arch flickered to life. At first, only static. Then video. Grant's penthouse living room. The camera angle high. Unmistakable. His voice filled the speakers. Clear as day. She won't even notice, he was saying, pacing near the bookshelf. By the time we're married, everything roots through us. Vivian's voice responded from off-screen. Make sure the devices are discreet. If she pushes back, we tighten slowly. A collective intake of breath moved through the guests. Grant's face drained of color. That's private footage, he snapped. You had no right. You installed surveillance in my home without consent, I said, still calm. That's documented. Claire stepped slightly forward. Additionally, she said, preliminary review of certain financial transfers within Whitmore Development has been forwarded to appropriate oversight bodies. Now the room truly shifted. 2 board members stood halfway, then sat again. Vivian's phone buzzed loudly in her hand. Grant stared at me as if seeing a stranger. You went behind my back, he hissed. You were already behind mine, I replied. Claire's voice remained measured. Effective immediately. Integration of Brooks Interior Architecture into Whitmore Development is suspended. Joint venture accounts are frozen pending review. Frozen. The word echoed louder than any music. Eleanor rose abruptly from her seat. This is outrageous, she declared. You're humiliating this family. I met her gaze. Humiliation was earlier, I said quietly. This is response. Grant stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. You're destroying everything. I could smell his cologne. Familiar, expensive, suddenly suffocating. You tried to own everything, I answered. The screen behind us paused on a still frame of him pointing toward the camera mount in my living room. The symbolism needed no explanation. Guests were no longer laughing. Some were recording. Others were whispering words that traveled like sparks. Control. Manipulation. Investigation. Grant attempted one final pivot, turning to the crowd. This is a misunderstanding, he said loudly. Natalie is emotional. We'll resolve this privately. I stepped slightly away from him, creating visible space between us. Transparency isn't emotional, I said. It's necessary. Claire closed her folder gently. The agreement was signed voluntarily, she added. The consequences are contractual. The officiant quietly stepped back, unsure where to look. The string quartet had stopped entirely. Grant's shoulders, once squared with certainty, seemed smaller now. He looked around at the faces that had admired him minutes earlier. He no longer had their full attention. He no longer had control of the narrative. He had tried to establish dominance with a shove. Instead, he had triggered every protection he had dismissed as harmless paperwork. And as the sun dipped lower over the lake, it became painfully clear that this ceremony was no longer a celebration. It was an exposure. The music never started again. The violinist lowered her bow slowly, uncertainty replacing melody. Guests remained seated, unsure whether to clap, leave, or pretend none of this was happening. The lake behind us stayed calm, indifferent to the fracture unfolding beneath white roses and crystal light. Grant stood beside me. no longer smiling. Two of Whitmore Development's senior board members approached the aisle, their polished shoes clicking sharply against marble. "Grant," one of them said quietly, though not quietly enough. "Is any of this accurate?" Grant inhaled, pulling his shoulders back. "This is a personal dispute being dramatized," he replied. "Nothing more." Claire's voice cut through with controlled precision. "The compliance inquiry was initiated prior to today. The conduct observed during this ceremony activates suspension clauses signed by both parties." The word inquiry settled heavily in the air. Vivian's phone vibrated again in her hand. She glanced down, her expression tightening. Grant noticed. "What now?" he muttered under his breath. She didn't answer him. One of the board members turned slightly away, already typing on his own phone. Another guest, a local business journalist I recognized from a charity gala, slipped toward the edge of the seating area, phone raised discreetly to his ear. This was no longer contained. "This is absurd," Grant said. Louder now. "There is no misconduct. There is no coercion. This is being exaggerated." I watched his posture shift from dominance to defense in real time. "You shoved me," I said evenly, "in front of 200 witnesses. It was a joke." "A joke doesn't require control," I replied. The board member nearest him frowned. "Grant, we need clarity," he said. Claire stepped forward slightly. "Under the vendor consolidation addendum," she stated calmly, "activation of the suspension clause halts pending equity integration and restricts access to joint venture capital allocations until review concludes." Grant's head snapped toward her. "You froze accounts," he demanded. "Temporarily," Claire answered. As agreed. Eleanor rose again from the front row, her composure fraying. "This is family business," she insisted sharply. "It should never have been made public. Family business doesn't include hidden surveillance," I replied. A hush followed. Vivian's phone buzzed again, this time audibly. She glanced down, then back up at Grant. "They've scheduled a compliance review," she said quietly. 72 hours. The words seemed to drain something from him. "That's routine," he snapped. "Routine audits happen all the time. Routine audits don't trigger freeze notices," one of the board members replied. Several guests began standing now, not in applause, but in discomfort. Conversations sparked in clusters. Words traveled like currents. Control. Investigation. Misconduct. Grant stepped toward me suddenly, grabbing my arm just above the elbow. "Enough," he said under his breath. "You've made your point." I pulled my arm free before his fingers could tighten. "Don't," I said calmly. Two guests nearby saw the movement. He noticed them noticing. His hand dropped. "You're destroying everything," he repeated. "Quieter now." "No," I said. "I'm refusing to protect it." Eleanor approached us, voice low and furious. "You could have handled this privately," she hissed. I answered. "You all called it alignment." Vivian stepped closer, her face pale. "Major subcontractors are already pausing confirmation calls," she said. "They're asking questions." Grant turned toward her sharply. "This is manageable," he insisted. But his voice lacked certainty. The officiant, still standing awkwardly near the arch, cleared his throat. "Should we proceed?" he asked hesitantly. The question hung in the air like something absurd. I looked at Grant. For the first time since I met him, he didn't appear composed. He looked cornered. Not by me, by consequence. I faced the venue coordinator instead. "Cancel the reception," I said. Gasps rippled outward. Grant stared at me as if I had struck him. "You can't be serious." "I am." Claire closed her folder with quiet finality. "Until review concludes?" she said. Integration remained suspended. The board members exchanged tight nods and stepped away to make calls of their own. Guests began dispersing in waves, heels clicking, voices lowered but urgent. The floral arch stood untouched, perfect and useless. Grant remained at the altar, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the thinning crowd. He had chosen the stage. He had chosen the audience. And now that same audience was walking away from him. The shove had been meant to establish control. Instead, it had triggered a chain reaction that no charm, no smile, no carefully rehearsed vow could undo. As the last notes of whispered conversations drifted across the lake, it became clear that the collapse unfolding was no longer emotional. It was structural. And structures, once compromised publicly, do not return to their original shape. By the time the last guests began drifting toward their cars, the estate felt hollow. Staff moved quietly, dismantling centerpieces that had taken weeks to design. White roses were lifted from crystal vases and placed into cardboard boxes as if the celebration had never existed. The lake beyond the courtyard was dark now, its surface smooth and indifferent. I stepped out of the reception hall into the cool evening air. My heels echoed against stone. "Natalie." Grant's voice followed me across the courtyard. I didn't turn immediately. I let him walk the distance. "You blindsided me," he said when he reached me. His tone was no longer polished. It was tight, fractured. "You humiliated me in front of everyone who matters." I faced him calmly. "You shoved me in front of everyone who matters." His jaw flexed. "That was nothing," he insisted. "You're destroying my company over nothing." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm refusing to absorb it." He ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he was losing composure. "You could have handled this privately." "You handled everything privately," I said. "The cameras, the emails, the plans." His eyes darkened. That was strategy. That was control. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think anyone will trust you after this? No one partners with someone who detonates publicly." The threat was familiar. Isolation disguised as prediction. I didn't step back. "No one partners with someone who needs to shove control into place," I answered. Two valet attendants stood several yards away, pretending not to watch. They were watching. Grant noticed. He took a breath. Recalibrating. Eleanor emerged from the hall, pearls still perfect, though her expression was not. "This is beyond reckless," she said sharply. "You have embarrassed this family." I met her gaze. "Embarrassment happened when your son decided to assert ownership during vows." Her eyes flickered. "Just slightly. Marriage requires compromise," she replied coldly. "Compromise doesn't include surveillance," I said. For a moment, no one spoke. Vivian stepped out next. Phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call and looked at Grant. "Not at me. They've accelerated the review," she said quietly. "Subcontractor confirmations are paused." Grant stared at her. "That's temporary." She didn't answer. For the first time, I saw something different in her eyes. Not loyalty, not anger. Calculation. The family machine was assessing damage. I reached for my left hand slowly. The diamond caught the courtyard lights as I slid the ring off my finger. Grant's gaze dropped to the movement. "You're being dramatic," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I stepped forward and placed the ring gently on the stone ledge between us. "I'm being clear," I replied. The metal made the softest sound against stone. "A shove before vows isn't a joke," I said quietly. "It's a preview." He swallowed. "I was protecting what's mine," he muttered. "You were trying to own what isn't," I answered. The words landed harder than any accusation. For a brief second, I saw uncertainty in him. Not anger, not charm. Uncertainty. Behind us, a small group of remaining guests approached carefully. One of my investors stopped beside me. "You handled that with integrity," he said under his breath. Another board member gave a tight nod. Claire stepped into the courtyard, her presence steady as ever. "It's stable," she told me quietly. "Legally." That single word settled something inside my chest. Grant looked around, perhaps expecting sympathy, defense, alignment. There was none. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. "We need to leave," she said firmly. He didn't move at first. The wedding arch behind us still glowed softly under artificial lights, pristine and unused. "I can fix this," he said finally, though it sounded more like a question. "No," I replied. The air between us felt different now. Not tense. Not electric. Final. He stared at the ring resting on the stone. "You'll regret this," he said. I shook my head once. I already regret what I almost ignored. Eleanor guided him away. Vivian followed. Still glancing at her phone, the Whitmore family retreated together, their formation tight and silent. I remained standing in the courtyard long after their footsteps faded. The staff continued packing away evidence of a celebration that never happened. I felt something like grief. But it wasn't for the marriage. It was for the version of the story I had once believed. Claire stepped beside me. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. I didn't hesitate. Yes. The lake was dark now, reflecting nothing. He had shoved me to make me smaller. Instead, he had shown me exactly how small he was willing to be. And once you see that clearly, there is no going back. The morning after the wedding, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. It started at 6:14 in the morning. News alerts, missed calls, text messages from numbers I didn't immediately recognize. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of my condo, listening to the quiet. No faint electrical hum from hidden cameras. No second phone on the nightstand monitoring mine. Just silence. I reached for my phone. A local business blog had already posted a headline. "Ceremony turns corporate as Whitmore merger suspended." Another outlet phrased it more bluntly. "Bride halts wedding over control dispute." Clips from guests had begun circulating. The shove. My smile. The screen lighting up behind us. I watched one video once. Just once. From that angle, the shove looked even smaller than it had felt. And somehow, even clearer. By mid-morning, Claire called. "They've escalated the compliance review," she said without preamble. "It's no longer preliminary." I sat at the kitchen island, the same island where I had first opened that email 3 weeks earlier. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means documentation matters," she replied. "And you documented everything." Whitmore Development issued a brief statement by noon. It described the incident as a private misunderstanding, amplified by contractual misinterpretation. It promised cooperation with oversight bodies. It did not mention surveillance. It did not mention the shove. Grant attempted a follow-up interview with a local reporter 2 days later. His tone was measured, careful. He described the wedding disruption as emotional overreaction. The footage contradicted him. Within 72 hours, 2 subcontractors paused negotiations. A third requested clarification before moving forward with a major development contract. Stock analysts began speculating quietly about leadership stability. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. I went to work. Brooks' interior architecture retained full autonomy. Integration discussions were formally terminated. Claire ensured every clause remained intact. My investors reached out not to question my judgment, but to affirm it. One of them said something that stayed with me. "Leadership isn't about dominance," he told me. "It's about boundaries." The cameras were removed from my condo that week. Every single one. The maintenance team uninstalled them while I stood in the living room, arms folded, watching as each small device was detached from the walls and ceilings. The green LEDs went dark one by one. The space felt larger afterward, not physically, energetically. I replayed the moment at the altar more than once in the days that followed. Not obsessively, not painfully, analytically. The shove had lasted less than a second, but what it revealed had been years in the making. Control rarely begins with force. It begins with small corrections, with suggestions that isolate, with contracts that quietly tilt leverage, with jokes that test how much you will tolerate in public. The shove was not the beginning. It was confirmation. Messages began arriving from women I had never met. Some were executives. Some were entrepreneurs. Some were married for decades. Some newly engaged. They all used different words. But the theme was the same. I ignored the signs. I thought I was overreacting. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. That sentence appeared again and again. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. Silence protects appearance. It does not protect you. A week later, a small velvet box arrived by courier. The engagement ring. No note. No apology. No demand. Just the ring. I opened the box. The diamond caught the light the same way it had the night he proposed. For a moment, I felt something close to grief. Not for him. For the version of myself who almost believed love required shrinking. I closed the box. I did not return it. I did not wear it. I placed it in a drawer and closed that chapter with the same steadiness I had stood at the altar. Whitmore Development entered a formal audit phase within the month. Grant remained CEO. But reports described internal restructuring. Board oversight increased. Leadership confidence was described as under evaluation. Consequences have a way of unfolding quietly once the spotlight moves on. I never filed a lawsuit beyond enforcing the contract. I didn't need revenge. The contract was enough. Weeks later, I drove past Lakeview Harbor Estate on my way to meet a client. Another wedding was taking place. Another white arch. Another string quartet. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt clarity. Dignity is not silence. Dignity is the refusal to participate in your own diminishment. If you've ever felt a moment where something small didn't sit right, where a comment, a joke, a protective gesture felt slightly off, I hope you remember this story. Not because of the spectacle, but because of the preparation. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to protect someone else's control at the expense of your own autonomy. If you've ever ignored a red flag to keep the peace, tell me what it was. Your story might help someone else recognize theirs sooner. And if you believe boundaries are worth defending, even when it costs you comfort, reputation, or a carefully planned future, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Because we're not here to stay silent about the things we were taught to endure quietly. He thought that shove would make me smaller. It was the moment I decided I would never shrink again.